Welcome back to Found in Translation, the talk show that stacks truth about politics and the latest news headlines. This is your host, Collazo. Thank you so much for joining us on the Found in Translation podcast and talk show. You can listen to the radio version of Found in Translation at WPPM LP 106.5 in Philadelphia, which you can also hear on WPPM's TuneIn app feed, as well as, of course, anywhere you can download a podcast. You can find Found in Translation on the Raised Latino Talk podcast feed, iTunes, Stitcher, and anywhere else you can download a podcast. This is your host, Collazo. You can find me on social media at Raised Podcast on Twitter and at Raised Latino Talk on Instagram. Later on in the show, I will share why today, that's right, today, or tomorrow morning, depending when you ended up listening to this, August 12th, August 13th, but today on August 12th, had the most important announcement related to the 2020 presidential election to date. Yes, the most important announcement related to next year's elections, and I'll explain why. And later on in the show, again, I will give my Puerto Ricans homework that they must do to ground themselves for the next step in our movement to take back control of our island and the diaspora. Again, you're listening to Ray Collazo here on Found in Translation. And again, thank you so much for joining us. But first, let me tell y'all, this is sort of a special early in the week edition for our Found in Translations fans. We normally air a podcast, which essentially is the recording of our radio show, or in some cases now increasingly sort of our video talk shows that we're doing digitally on various platforms, including Periscope and Facebook Live, which I know people enjoy. And oftentimes there's a video component to our shows, again, whether we're in studio at WPPM Studios, which we air live on Facebook and Instagram, or with our other video platforms that we use. So normally, but if you listen to the audio version of that show, we typically upload it late on a Thursday night, sometimes very early on a Friday morning after the radio program on Thursday night. But I had to do a special early in the week show because there's just too much going on. So I'm going to take my shot of Pepsi here. It's getting a little late here on the East Coast, but there's just too much information. I think it's very important that we understand what's happening and make sense of today's news headlines, and specifically to not only provide people accurate information, because there's going to be even more confusion, more concern, particularly with our immigrant brothers and sisters about today's events, but specifically I want people to understand what they can do in the moment in history that we're in, the moment that, as Michael Moore said very eloquently on MSNBC the other day, the moment we have to understand it's not about winning an election next year, it's about killing a movement in this case of white supremacy that is not only going to severely impact people of color in this country. And again, I go back to the question we all must ponder about the importance of next year's elections. Do you want to be South Africa circa 1974? Or do you want to continue on some reasonable path to the democracy that we've all assumed we would have our whole lives? So that's basically on some level what's fundamentally at stake in next year's elections. And the electoral element of that, which I'm going to talk about later in the show, I thought was just too important to wait a few days. And again, the first item we're going to discuss in the show is very important to the immigrant community, and it's a very complicated issue, has a lot of technical language around it. So I want to make sure we discussed it in real time. I want to again update everyone on the announcement today by the Trump administration that reconfirms the biggest lie of his administration. The premise of his presidential campaign was that the problem in the country wasn't income inequality. It wasn't the rising debt that our students and all Americans on some level are accumulating in a rapid rate. It's not our nation's deficit. It's not the rising, exploding cost of healthcare. It's not the climate change crisis that we're in the midst of that we're already in the midst of, frankly. But indeed, his claim was that the problem with this country was this quote unquote invasion of undocumented immigrants. And so today's announcement really blows a hole in even his false premise. So let's get to it. On Monday, the administration announced the final version of the new quote-unquote public charge rule that is scheduled to go into effect on October 15th, of course, pending legal challenges, which we'll talk about in a second. This rule, let me share with you all how this rule will impact us. I want to, first of all, begin which sort of the basis of it, it is a complicated issue, hard to explain. And so I wanted to make sure that we gave you all sort of a few ways of thinking about this rule. So basically the premise of public charge is that if you're an immigrant in this country, now we're talking about legal immigration. So if you're a legal immigrant in this country, there should be a threshold in which you are evaluated to be a net positive economically for our country. And so essentially, you should not be either on any or very limited forms. The access that you would have, even as a legal citizen, so with a green card, someone in the process of becoming a naturalized citizen, someone in many cases that's living in a mixed status family with citizen spouses, citizen partners, citizen children, but in this case, that legal immigrants should not have access to essentially any form of direct or indirect public assistance in federal programs. So let me give it to you sort of in real time example, right? So let's say you are a U.S. citizen and you have diabetes and you're on Medicaid, and that provides you the medical benefits that you need so that you can live because you need insulin. Your partner is a legal immigrant to this country, and they also receive Medicaid through you, through your relationship. So, and you also have citizen children that have medical benefits through your being in your household. So what the public charge would do, which essentially now is going to provide a financial threshold for green card holders and people applying, legal residents and people applying for green cards in this country, if this rule were to take effect, is to now basically put a price on your spouse's head to say, well, this person can no longer receive those benefits, because if they were to receive these Medicaid benefits by the relationship they have with you, citizen, partner, spouse, they would no longer be eligible to be legally here, and they could potentially lose or would lose, in this case, their green card, or their application to green card would be valid. Or so basically you would have to make the choice, U.S. citizen that is on Medicaid and has diabetes, with either losing that Medicaid, and in fact your whole family losing that Medicaid, your children losing that Medicaid, your spouse losing that Medicaid, or cutting loose your spouse, your partner. So this rule, which in the grand scheme of things, we're talking about infinitesimal, minuscule amounts of money, when an administration just passed less than 2 years ago a tax cut law that gave $1.3 trillion back to the wealthiest Americans and largest corporations. But you're the problem. You legal immigrants, no longer just immigrants, legal immigrants are now the problem. So I just gave you that family hypothetical because there's two things I want people to get out of this conversation. Is that one is that, again, this takes away the veneer, further takes away the veneer that this was at all about just undocumented immigrants. This was about attacking not only the immigrant community, but the Latino community writ large. And we've seen the literal consequences of that rhetoric and those attacks, not only in policy, but in rhetoric. And now people are literally getting killed for being Latino while they're going out and spending money in our economy, in the case of the Walmart tragedy. But this puts into focus that this administration's strategy not only includes really includes policies that attack not just undocumented immigrants, or not just immigrants, but really anyone associated with the immigrant community, particularly in the Latino community. So we're talking about a rule that would basically have families choose between, do I stay on my rental assistance program for me and my citizen children, or do I divorce my wife and divorce my spouse, or do I become homeless to keep my family together? These are the kind of decisions that, if this rule is to be fully implemented, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of families in this country will go through. The National Immigration Law Center estimates that if this rule is fully implemented, 55,000 U.S. citizen children would become homeless because they would lose access to housing, affordable housing, through the federal rental assistance programs. So let's be clear about what's at stake. I want to read to you from my colleague at Unidos US, Carlos Guevara, who's one of our leading immigration policy experts. Let me read to you his quote today. Carlos Guevara, senior policy advisor on immigration issues at Unidos US, quote, "The administration is doubling down on its attack against Latinos. First with the Mississippi raids last week, and now with the so-called, quote-unquote, public charge rule. Let's be clear. This is about restricting legal immigration and puts the health and well-being of millions of American children at risk. Millions of American children at risk. Remember, these are people that live in mixed status families. It's even worse that this is happening on the heels of the El Paso shooting, one of the most depraved acts of violence targeting Latinos." Well said, Carlos Guevara. And the irony of this whole thing is that another interesting note that comes out today, and I encourage people to check out Nicole Acevedo from NBCnews.com's article on this issue, is that Nielsen reports, one of the leading resources for information around economic trends and demographic trends and marketing trends in this country, releases a study today that finds Latinos are arguably the biggest engines of this country's economic growth. 75% of new people entering the workforce are Latino, with an estimated 1.9 trillion GDP just within the Latino community in this country by 2023. That's Latinos alone in this country are a larger economy than Mexico, a larger economy than Australia. So on one hand, you have the president blaming issues in this country, some of which are very legitimate. Essentially some people's lack of economic growth or economic mobility, or this generation's continued economic mobility, not on income inequality and some of the automation or these other legitimate issues that he could be discussing, but he's blaming that on the community that's actually helping grow the economy despite his restrictive policies, his terrible policies around trade, his policies that are just expanding income inequality, his terrible tax policies. And we're never going to talk about losing our standing in the world through his foreign policies. So instead of demonizing our community, he should be, and the rest of the country should be thanking us, including those families in Mississippi that work in poultry and food processing plants that you couldn't pay Americans top dollar to work in, and certainly not move to rural Mississippi. Should be thanking those people. Keep informed around how you can inform, particularly the immigrant community, around the next steps, what's going to happen with the legal court cases, which I imagine will be happening. NILC has already announced they'll be suing in court to block this rule. Unidos US is going to provide a lot of resources, particularly for our immigrant community, around information around how this rule could impact them, their legalization process, and their access to very important federal programs, particularly in healthcare and housing and other issues. And stay informed and communicate to people to not be scared, but stay informed around what's happening. When we come back, I'm going to tell you about what today, on August 12th, in my opinion, was as big a political announcement as we're going to have that could impact the 2020 elections in a positive way. You're listening to the Found in Translation talk show with Ray Collazo. Welcome back to the Found in Translation's talk show. This is your host, Ray Collazo. Again, Found in Translation is the talk show, podcast, radio program, sometimes a YouTube show, where we stack truth around politics and news issues impacting our country from a diverse perspective. This is your host, Ray Collazo. Again, thank you so much for joining Found in Translation. This is a special audio-only edition because I just got to say what I got to say, and there's a lot going on. So the other thing I wanted to announce, and the reason I'm saying that this is, again, in my opinion, mark it down, Monday, August 12th, one of the biggest announcements, the biggest announcement that could impact the 2020 presidential election was actually made in Texas today. Longtime organizer, immigrant rights activist, civic engagement, and labor activist Cristina TzinTzun Ramirez has announced her run for the Texas Senate race. She'll be running a Democratic primary against already a pretty crowded field. If she were to win the Democratic primary, would take on longtime U.S. Republican Senator John Cornyn, and what to me would be one amongst the most exciting races in the 2020 election cycle, even as exciting, if not more exciting on some level, as the president. Cristina TzinTzun, from personal experience, I could tell you, is a total political rock star. She has pressured Texas politicians to enact progressive policies on a city, local, and federal level. As an outsider for many years, now she's looking to enact those changes from within the system. This is a very exciting announcement. You know, Cristina is currently the executive director. Well, now she's going to take a leave of absence, but she's currently the executive director of JOLT, a civic engagement and advocacy organization, electoral organization in Texas that advocates to get the Latinx community to register to vote and mobilize in elections and in advocacy work. She does a fantastic job. Cristina's a really special activist. You know, this is really, I reached out to some activists in Texas today, kind of trying to take the temperature of what they were feeling. Was they as excited as I was? And they are. And I think the biggest thing from an activist perspective about Cristina's run, Cristina TzinTzun Ramirez, who's running for U.S. Senate in Texas, is that it's going to test this hypothesis. Because one of the arguments we've been making for a long time, particularly our Texas activists, has been, you know, we can't really measure the true interest and the true potential impact of the Latinx and diverse voting bloc in Texas until we run candidates statewide that really reflect the values and the background of those communities. Because, you know, one of the dirty secrets of the Beto O'Rourke run, which was historic and really exciting against Ted Cruz last year, was that he over-indexed for a Democrat. But the reality is he definitely left some votes on the table, particularly in minority communities, particularly in the Latino community. And part of that was Beto, I guess, in terms of the strategy and the focus of the turnout. But part of that was, you know, field organization, frankly. And if he had sort of A- field game in Black and Latino areas, he might be able to pull it off. So this is really going to test it. There's no question Cristina, who's known for field mobilization on a statewide level in Texas, there's no question she's going to have a good field operation if she would win the primary. She's going to have the money. She's already been tapped by the Flip the Senate campaign, which is a national progressive mobilizing effort to support progressive Democratic Senate candidates throughout the country in key states that could potentially flip the Senate in places like Georgia and Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. And Sean King highlighted his support for Cristina earlier today on his social media platforms with the announcement of Flip the Senate. And I believe Cristina could be on some level, the most important factor in next year's presidential election. Because if Cristina were to win the primary, and I predict she will, the other major opponents she has are basically typical Texas Democrats that typically won statewide. They're very moderate. They're very sort of Republican light. They try to position themselves as a very mild, unthreatening alternative to Republican candidates. That's why they always lose. But truly, for Cristina can, I believe will, mobilize the Texas Democratic base, the progressive community, really the coalition you need to win. There aren't too many light-skinned Latinas that can walk into a black church and rock it. And I've seen Cristina do that myself. This is a special political talent. Definitely look up Cristina TzinTzun. And when you have a name like TzinTzun, I mean, come on, you know you're going to kill it. Cristina TzinTzun is one to watch. And I think that, to finish my point, I think that her ratcheting up sort of the Beto 3.0, if you will, turnout in Texas is going to galvanize us to invest in Texas, understand the importance of Texas, believe in Texas. And if y'all know the electoral map, you know that if we win Texas, not only do we win the presidency, not only do we potentially flip the Senate, but that goes a long way of driving a stake in the heart of this repressive Republican Party, which is not just about being an ultra-right party anymore, because that's not really what it's about. It's about being a white nationalist party, which has a couple of old conservative tenets that they use to keep people justifying the support. Because they're not a party about fiscal responsibility anymore. Anyone looked at these budgets lately that they proposed? They're not they're not they have no moral standing unless you want to argue, the abortion issue. I mean, there's nothing about their platform other than arguably the life movement that has any basis in morality. What else do they stand for? They don't stand for working people. They don't stand for I guess gun owners. So they're about violence and white nationalism and a veneer of Christianity. Because Jesus wasn't about putting people in cages. Jesus, mi Jesucristo, was not about dividing people, hurting people, caging people, punishing people, pa nada, and making that little girl cry in Mississippi the other day. Is that what Jesus was about? So that's a bastardization of Christianity in any analysis you can give. Racism is a sickness that needs to be stopped, and it's going to take a lot of work. And we have to have Texas, unlike what many of these pundits are going to say on television, Texas has to be a big part of that equation. Because if we get Texas mobilized and we flip Texas in this cycle, we can't wait till 24. We don't have time. I mean, our climate will be ruined by then. We don't have time. Cristina TzinTzun, you heard it here first. One of the most important announcements, even not the most important announcement that's going to impact November 2020 was the announcement of that woman, that dear woman, dear colleague, dear friend. You heard her on our podcast last year. It was in 2018, one of the most riveting, popular episodes that we had of Found in Translation, which was called Raise Latino Talk Podcast at the time, show in 2018, Cristina TzinTzun. Cristina TzinTzun Ramirez, throwing her hat in the ring in Texas. God bless you, sister. We're so excited about having you in the field. We're going to support you. I mean, to say it 100% is downplaying it. This is a special political talent, a special organizer, and we're really excited about Cristina's run. And again, I believe it is part of the winning formula to not only flip Texas, win the presidency, but save our democracy. When we come back, a little homework for you Puerto Ricans. Welcome back to the Found Translation radio show, podcast, YouTube show. We got it going on. Thank you again for joining us. You heard about public charge, the impact on our community there, and the sort of messaging and the pushback that we need to have on that and understand what it's about and how we protect our immigrant communities. We talked about electorally what I believe is one of the most important, if not the most important, frankly, announcements that could impact the fate of our democracy next year. And I wanted to mention before the end of the show, David Begnaud, the celebrated CBS reporter, who's really been the patron saint of the island of Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican community over the last few years, post Maria, has been doing like this book club thing where he's reading this book, which I actually own a copy of. And I must admit, I had perused, but never really sat down and read the whole thing. I'd read excerpts, chapters, pieces. But I'm starting to again read it. And it is really, I believe, something that every Puerto Rican, particularly in the diaspora, should not only read, but share with their family, share with their children to understand. As I put on Facebook, put on Facebook, it really gives you, and I'm talking about the book War Against All Puerto Ricans, Revolution and Terror in America's Colony by Nelson Dennis. Again, it's a very thought-provoking cover. You should be able to find it at anywhere you can buy a book or get a book online or in person. But the War Against All Puerto Ricans really sort of lays out a history of the colonization of Puerto Rico over the last 100+ years and how that's impacted the Puerto Rican community, not only the island, but the diaspora. Why the diaspora happened. It explains a lot for people like, wow, I grew up in Chicago. Why did I grow up in Chicago? Or why did I grow up in the Bronx? Or why did I grow up in North Philly? Or why did I moved to Orlando in the 80s. That it really explains the conditions that in many ways through economics and political and labor forces forced many of our families, 2/3 of our community, to leave the island over the last decades. And it really gives you an understanding of the psyche of the Puerto Rican condition, because particularly on the island and in the diaspora, there's the sense of really before, leading up to Hurricane Maria, this sense of hopelessness, the sense of, why our community can't get it together. Why isn't the island more with all this talent, all this relatively strong education system, this creativity, this energy? Why isn't the island able to progress politically, economically, and why aren't our diaspora, particularly in some of our segregated pockets in urban America, why can't more of us progress with all these assets that we have as a population? And despite these obvious examples of incredible success by some of us. And so the War Against Puerto Ricans, this book, Revolution and Terror in America's Colony, really, I think gives people, it's going to make you upset. It's going to make you think, and it's going to make you, it's going to be very thought-provoking for you, but I think it's very important. And again, I want to give a shout out to David Begnaud, the CBS reporter, who's essentially doing a sort of on his Facebook feed, sort of a book club segments where he's analyzing chapters and sharing people this information. There are people in our community, particularly academics, that question some of the factual, historical nuggets that Nelson Dennis provides. That's up for scholars to debate. But I think it's clear that this gives you a good framework for how we got to this condition, how we got to these dynamics, which led to sort of the boiling point with the Ricky Renuncia call over the last few weeks, and now the eventual resignation of our governor, and this sort of positive unifying moment for the island of Puerto Rico and the diaspora. And I encourage people to read War Against All Puerto Ricans. We had many people on Facebook asking me, requesting, hey, we should invite the author, Nelson Dennis, former assemblyman and academic, a great champion for the Puerto Rican Latino community, to join us on the show. And I think that's a fantastic idea. So I know David Collazo and other friends in New York have a good relationship with Dennis. I've met him over the years, and we've actually tried to bring him on the show, but just logistics and time and everything else, it didn't work out. But I'm sure he's a very accessible guy. I'm sure he's going to get a few nice royalty checks because of David co-signing on this. So I'm really happy for Don Nelson for this sort of renewed interest in his book, which he published several years ago. So Puerto Ricans out there, and anyone that's interested in the Puerto Rican community, I suggest you purchase and read War Against All Puerto Ricans by Nelson Dennis. And again, I want to thank all of you for and more homework. You need to download and subscribe, share with your friends the Founding Translation radio show, talk show, and podcast. Again, the radio program you can hear every Tuesday at 11 o'clock on WPPMLP 106.5 in Philadelphia. And of course, the podcast, anywhere you can download a podcast. Download, subscribe, share, iTunes, all the Android, the Pandoras, the Spotify, iHeartRadio, radio.com. There's no excuse for not downloading, subscribing the Founding Translation talk show. And thank you all so much for continuing to advocate for our community and do the right thing. I'm so proud to be part of, in my small way, fostering a community of people that fundamentally just care about the world, care about each other, have a spirit of positivity, and want to continue to support each other. Despite this dark period in our nation's history, there's still a whole lot of light and a whole lot of good folks that want to move our country forward. And in the case of the Latino community, we're the largest economic engine. So you're welcome. Thank you so much for joining the Founding Translation Talk Show, and have a wonderful day.